Hi, everybody, and welcome to Season 6 of For the Love of Jewelers podcast. I'm your host, Mark Nelson, and joining me once again is my co-host, Fiona Morrison. And I kind of don't like it when you win the rock, paper, scissors game because they always make me the host. When it's your show, man, you're the star of this show, especially today with our special guests.
No, it's randomly generated, I'm sure.
Oh, randomly generated. Okay.
On today's show, we have a special guest who is near and dear to my heart, my very own mother, Annie Osburn. Annie is an award-winning author, podcast host, and fiber artist. Her work has been in publications like Lapidary Journal, Southwest Art Magazine, and National Geographic Traveler. She brings a wonderful perspective on the jewelry industry and the artists that power it. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so exciting to be here with you.
And what she left out is you're an amazing model for her jewelry.
Exactly. Almost everything I have on today, you made. Thank you so much.
Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
So getting into a little bit about your background, how did you get into art and how did that really grow up with you? How did you grow up with art and get to where you are today?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, for many years, as you probably know, I've written about artists, also jewelry artists. My story is probably similar to what you would hear in an interview when I asked that question to an artist. How did you get started? Yeah. And it's so common to hear one or two experiences in early childhood, some influence that stuck with that person that might not have even evolved until they were older. It can be subconscious. You're sort of surprised later when you say, oh, wow, that really affected me wanting to become a jewelry designer or something like that. For me, my mother was a painter, so I grew up with a lot of oil paint in my house, and she would take me along to her lessons. She had a teacher she would see. And to, I guess, get rid of me and get me out of the studio when I was about 11 or 12, they would send me up to Jean, her teacher's private apartment where she had stacks and stacks of National Geographic magazines. And so these towers of yellow spines were there. And she said, pick a picture that you might want to paint, and I'll teach you how to watercolor. So, of course, the issue I picked was probably published in the 1970s. And I flipped right to a story about Santa Fe.
Oh, geez.
And I was in Florida, so I was nowhere near Santa Fe at the time. I spent my early childhood in Florida. And I think there was something about that story that impacted me so much. Even though I was around art, there was something about the photos and the concept of artists working together, collaborating, community, and the ability to live like an artist. You know, I had always heard, oh, it's great now, but you'll have to study something else in college or get a real job, things like that. So I thought, wow, these people are doing it. So I think that just stuck with me. And it wasn't until, so this would have been in like the early 1970s or whatever that I saw that. It wasn't until the late 1980s that I actually moved to Santa Fe and started writing about artists. So I think it really propelled me there. And that was an early experience. So if that's a good answer, I don't know.
Yes. Yeah. So it's really shaped sort of how you progress from there with coming here to New Mexico and getting into looking at artists.
It did. And what was funny was, I had been a freelance writer for several years before that. So I went to college. I had real jobs for 2 years, and I realized that just wasn't for me. I wanted to be on my own and do it. And my dad worked for himself, and he always said, if you can, work for yourself. So that was also stuck in there. And I worked in a big ad agency, and we hired a copywriter, that's what we always called them in those days, to do an annual report for a large investment company that was a client. And I got to manage him because I was a junior, AE, and they didn't want to bother with him. And he was awesome. So he would take me to lunch and he would say, I think you want to do what I do. Let me teach you how to do it. And so it was incredible. He must have seen something. So when I say teach me how to do it, he taught me how to write a proposal, an invoice, an estimate. I mean, those are really powerful things to know how to do to get yourself started. So I think that got me into that, channel, and I was doing a lot of business writing, let's say, for companies. So when I moved to Santa Fe, in those days, I had a compact portable, which was a big deal to have your own computer, but it was like heavier than a sewing machine, right?
Right.
So I left it with my best friend, and I said, under no circumstances, send me that computer. I want to have a life where I'm not just working 24/7. I want to just work in a gallery or a coffee shop or something, right? So I think I went to a temp agency, and I could type really fast. I could type crazy, like 120 words a minute. And I got a temp job at an insurance company across from the Santa Fe New Mexican. And I had done everything that my employer would ever wanted me to do by noon. And he would go have, a couple martinis at lunch. And he came back a few hours later and he said, so what do you really do? I remember saying, well, I've been trying to hide this. He said, come on over here. I've got someone to introduce you to. So he walked me across the street and introduced me to some of the editors. And he said, this is where you're going to stay right now. I don't need you back. So then I was begging my friend to send me my laptop, and she refused, or my computer. She refused to do that. So that's how that got started. And then I started writing about artists for the New Mexican and other local publications. And what was really crazy was probably within that first year, I realized I had written about 2 or 3 people from that National Geographic article.
Yeah.
It was this great full circle moment of I was there with them and I was experiencing that life and seeing it. And it was hard. It's very hard to make a living on $40 stories and live in Santa Fe.
Oh, yeah.
I managed somehow.
Well, on that note, a lot of jewelers tell a story with their work.
Mhm.
How did you, telling that story then about the jeweler, communicate what they were trying to communicate?
Mhm. So I had written about other artists for about maybe 4 or 5 years before I did my first piece about a jewelry designer. So that would be painters, sculptors, photographers. And I think it was 1990, I got an assignment to do a profile about Tom Herman, Seven Fingers. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Yeah.
And he was living in Santa Fe at the time. And it was for Ornament magazine. And there was something instantly about when I was in that studio with that jewelry designer. It was totally different than being in a painter's studio. Totally different. The tools, everything that I came to call sort of big mind, where when you see a jeweler at a bench, there are all of these thoughts going on. So there's fear, anxiety, design, skill, luck, all kinds of things that are in this huge head, right? And all of it is being focused down to this tiny little thing on the workbench. And to keep watching how that happens, that process was so fascinating to me that I thought just in the trial and error and even the mistakes, a stone cracks, something melts, something happens, that jeweler has to be okay with it or throw it or, adapt.
Yeah.
Those things, which, Mark, I'm sure you've seen with your work with educators.
Experienced.
Yeah. So, that was so exciting for me to know that everything was happening in real time. So that story was being told in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one aspect of it. But then the other thing that became really clear to me was with jewelry, the power of adornment is undeniable.
Oh, yeah.
Jewelry makers have a unique opportunity to connect with the wearer in this deep and symbolic way. So separate from the story that the jeweler might be creating at the time, it will have a whole other life and a whole other story by the person who wears it. So you have these multiple layers of stories, this thing that never dies, that just keeps growing. And the piece can become an heirloom piece. There's another story. So I just couldn't get enough of it. And I thought, this is great. This is really my focus, my population.
And you really saw the human behind the pieces as well, the artist, and was able to experience the side of things that a lot of people don't see.
Mm-hmm.
They see the finished piece. They don't see the human who's making it and that experience that they're going through. And that story that they themselves are creating in order to make the piece.
They also don't see how dirty it is.
Yes.
It's dirty.
Yeah,
Workbenches are dirty. Studios are messy. Only every now and then do I see a jewelry designer who has the meticulous studio. And my first question is, well, where's the real room?
Right.
Is this for the photos? So that is also really fascinating to be able to create beauty. It's like that diamond in the rough kind of concept. I mean, jewelry designers are constantly living in that world.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And having written for these publications, and what was that like, especially in the early days of when people think of artists when they might be starting out? And how did that impact your career going forwards?
Well, I got really lucky because I did somehow or other, I don't know how I ended up pitching some stories to Ornament Magazine, and I worked, contributed to them for about 2 or 3 years. But somehow or other, I was looking for a different venue. I can't quite remember. But I pitched a story to Lapidary Journal, which later rebranded to Lapidary Journal Jewelry Artist around 2007. So this was 95, 94. And I had just the most amazing editor. So that had a lot to do with it. I contributed regularly almost every month for 18 years with them because she was incredible. So she would give me ideas. Sometimes she would give me the pick. I could bring her any idea. She'd go for it. I'm taking a trip to Italy. I want to write about glass artists. Sure, send it in, So that was really wonderful. So I didn't feel the same constrictions that I had had for many years with painters and sculptors, let's say, in various publications, where when I would pitch an idea, the question was, well, what gallery are they in? How long have they been painting? And this was really frustrating because I would just find amazing work out there and I could not get coverage for these artists. So getting back to what you were asking, these are the days without social media.
Yeah.
So how are you going to get discovered? A big thing is getting yourself written up, shows, getting into the big shows in those days. There were a few big shows. It wasn't like this huge saturation of craft markets. So it was really hard to get your work out there. So with jewelry, I could get more coverage more often for more designers. So that helped. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did, but also I'd love, and I'm sure the audience would love to know a little bit about your own experiences as a writer and coming to this with this creative vision. Just your own experiences going through this, writing about artists, how the industry was before social media.
It was slower. It was really nice. So most of and also because of where I lived, in New Mexico at that point, most of my interviews were in person. I could go into a studio and spend 4 hours, which I can't even imagine now, right? And it's funny because very quickly when we started speeding up with email and websites and all of that, so many of my interviews were happening over the phone, even if someone was down the street. Everything just sped up. Content, we didn't use that term then, but editors wanted more and they wanted it faster. So I couldn't take 3 or 4 hours and go somewhere. Also in those days, we weren't taking photos with our cell phones. So I would bring my SLR camera with me and hope that what I had in my slide film was going to work. And I would always take a few shots after I finished an interview or depending on what the scene was, during. So I would have that in the can. But in those days, jewelry designers had to spend a fortune to have professional photos taken. And you really had to make those images matter. I mean, it could be several $1,000s to find a photographer and you had to make sure, wow, are these my 6 best pieces?
Yeah.
What if I leave something out? And I would watch that angst that they would go through. And what was also difficult was some people would just try so hard and they would go and they'd spend a bundle and they'd send me 12 images and one would be used. And this was heartbreaking for me to see because I knew what they had invested and I had no control over what was in there. And so that was another reason why I loved my relationship with Lapidary Journal Jewelry Artists, because I always knew what they were going to use, how much, so I could be really clear and I wasn't making the artist have to overinvest and have them experience that letdown.
Yeah. Lapidary Journal was like my key magazine for
It was amazing.
decades.
Yeah.
Going, because I went to school in Flagstaff and then Texas Tech. And it was Lapidary Journal, man.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you got your inspiration. And that's how you learned about technique and shows and networking and who was who and everything. So
it was fantastic. So it started in 47. And then unfortunately, I think it kind of died with COVID. So I think 2021 was like the last issue. So, it went through changes. It went through different ownership and publishers. And there would be times where, I would hear, we need more how-to articles.
Yeah.
So, just the luxury of having, a feature story or profile, that began to become less and less because, the advertisers or the publishers wanted how-to articles.
Yeah.
And then they became less and less, kind of around the time they rebranded. So Merle, my editor, she came to me, I think it was around 2007, and she said, what do you think about doing a trends article, like a trends column? And I was like, okay, I'll try that. So I did it for 5 years, and it was actually really great. It was a 2-page spread. I could get 4 artists in there, which was like, wow, one big paragraph, one good image, and it was 4 more that wouldn't have been in a magazine. And so all you have to do is take that page, I'd say, put it in your portfolio, send it out there. That's gold.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about some fun stories, some artists that you saw, even outside of the jewelry industry, writing about these artists, being sort of in the thick of it with everybody. What are some fun experiences that you had?
Well, let's see. One of my first ones, actually, getting back to my beginning with Lapidary Journal. So I pitched a story to Merle, and she said, okay, great. Yeah, I'll take it. But can you do this other one first? And I said, sure. So it was Carrie Adele. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. Amazing. Mako Migane Shakudo, if I'm saying that correctly. She made work that I think she called touchstones. They were formed. You look it up. You'll know what it is. She was incredible. She was very highly regarded in those days. And so I went to her house and we did the interview. And at the end I said, hey, do you mind if I take some photos of you? And she said, hold on. So she went in the back, totally changed, put on sheath dress, came out with this diaphanous thing, took me out in the back, which was all xeriscape with these big sort of white rocks, threw herself down on her back and said, shoot me. And I was like, I loved her. And then one really cool thing that she showed me as I was leaving, she had turned her linen closet into a photo booth.
Oh,
and I had never seen this before. And she had the light, the camera, everything set up. And she said, every jewelry designer should photograph every single piece.
Yep.
You never know.
Yeah.
You could just sell it, give it away, and then you never have an image. So that was really powerful. Michael Boyd was obviously one of my favorites. I wrote about him several times. The first time I met him, I want to say 91, 92, he was in a converted chicken coop in Denver.
I read that article.
Yeah. And he said that I was the first person to interview him, the first time he'd been written about. And, he's a genius if you've met him. Even then, he had this sort of elfin sparkle in his eye where you knew, I'm not even going to capture everything that's here. So just strap in and kind of go for the ride. And his work was just sort of otherworldly, really incredible. And he had this bottomless energy. He was so excited about everything. Like he couldn't even be everywhere and do everything. So he asked me at one point, he was living in Salida, Colorado, and he asked me if I would come up or down, I remember where I was, and do something about the Salida art walk that I think he was starting.
Yeah.
And he took me everywhere. Harold O'Connor, he introduced me to everybody. I was there for so long, I think I slept on his couch. I stayed over because Salida's it was like in the middle of nowhere. So he was incredible. So every time I'd write about him, there would be a new generation of what he would do.
We'd like to thank today's sponsor, GRS Tools. Use promo code RIOGRS20 when you add select GRS Tools to your cart and save 20%. Now, through March 31st, upgrade your bench with top quality tools that make jewelry making tasks easier and more efficient.
I had some favorites. I don't know if you're familiar with James Barker.
Mm-mm.
Oh, wow. His
There's
work.
so many names.
I can't even imagine. His work was just amazing. He lived up north of Taos, so I'm I did an interview there. Kent Ribley,
Yeah, no
Granulation. He was really amazing. I think I happened to be in California where he was in like Mill Valley, maybe. I might be remembering this incorrectly, but he had grown very fast. He was an incredible goldsmith, and I just remember him sitting me down and saying, "I'm at this point," and I start to hear this point from other artists. I'm getting too big to do it all myself, but I'm worried about how to grow.
Yeah.
And it's a very real thing. I don't know what he did after that point. I didn't write about him again, but
he's got a school now.
Oh, does he?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay.
He's teaching. I think it's on the West Coast.
Okay, right, California.
But he won Saul Bell Design Awards twice.
Yeah, not hard to imagine.
And I got to hold his pieces in my hand, and I'm like,
and rub your fingers over the top of it. Yeah, I know.
He's an amazing guy.
Really amazing.
Amazing artist.
Yeah, he was incredible. Very kind, very open. Gosh, I'm trying to see. There's so many. I was looking through my index. I'm one of those crazy people. I keep an index of everybody I've written about and all my stories. And I was like, wow, I did a lot of stories. One story that I did, which was not for Lapidary Journal, it was for a magazine called Indian Artist Magazine, I think in those days, later turned into a book, Verma Nakwatiwa, who's the niece of Charles Lilima. So I kind of interviewed her briefly for another book I was working on, and then did that story. And then about 10 years later, she called and said, I'm ready for a book. I custom publish books. And when I went to Hopi to interview her, especially for the book, because I was there for 5 or 6 days, there's something magical that happens when you're with any artist really for a lengthy period of time, because even if they're quite talkative or have a huge ego, which we know some artists have, something different happens when you give them the length of time to talk about their work and you sort of hold it in this container for them. They begin to run out of gas from their usual story, which is going on in their mind and which is what they're telling people. And then there's this space where they return to, why am I doing this? I remembered that thing in the beginning, that challenge. I think I can handle it now. This magical segue happens after they've run out of the first reservoir of the usual stuff they talk about. And that's where the interview becomes transformative and not just informational.
Is it kind of like the source?
Yeah,
like
they can go back to it. Yeah.
They go back to the source.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
My first book I did was a woman who does woodblock printmaking. And so she had studied in Japan. And by the time I met her, she had probably been back for, 10 years or something, and lives in Texas. And so a lot of her subject matter was very Southwestern.
Yeah.
And I would have to say I didn't totally love the subject matter, but it totally sold for her. Right. It was great, right? She was so gifted and so talented. And when I went to work on her, I think I interviewed her for Southwest Art Magazine, and then she became my first book. But she took me into her farmhouse outside of the studio, walked me into her bedroom, and whoa, there it was. Yeah. That was it. That was the source. And I just said, what's it going to take to get you back there?
Right.
And it was a woodblock called Naha Morning. And I've written 3 books about her, and I finally got her to recreate that piece in the 3rd book. It took 3 books. I'm like, I'm not going away.
But you did it.
Until you get this piece, Get back to that source of why you did it. And it was really cool because she did, and then she redid it with all these different colors. And so, 40, 50 years later.
It's a new source.
Exactly. Yeah. But it was still there, and she really got about what was happening in her at that time when she was studying. So it was really beautiful.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the best part.
And there's so much new talent coming up too, and it exists. It's in flux, and then the stories are never going to end.
Yeah. Well, I wonder. So now that these magazines and the world is faster, and we're looking at social media and the craft shows, I think they kind of died down a bit during COVID. They're coming back, whatever. Yeah. I don't know where this new generation goes with this because. What worries me is sometimes I see such a focus on content on social media that I don't know if they have the time to really check in with their source. Yeah. And what are they creating and why?
Yeah. And that's probably something they're trying to figure out themselves. Mm-hmm. And I know there's a limited number of influences out there talking about that. I think that's the way I'm trying to say it.
Well, right.
You know what I mean? Because when I went to art school, I mean, that was a big thing. My graduate program, Robbie Glover, he's like, why do you do this? And I'm like, I just like making cool stuff, bro. You know, it's like, what's the big deal? And he drilled me. He's like, why?
Right.
And then we got to that source, you know, and how much of that is actually happening now.
So let me ask you, when you were doing this, you didn't have, I'm guessing here, you didn't have the impression of, I'm going to get out of art school and make a living as an artist, right?
No.
You thought you were going to teach.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So that's probably the first 10 years of me interviewing jewelry designers. I kept hearing, oh, I went out and I became a teacher, teacher. So with, not Etsy's great, but with Etsy and all these other venues that people can sell, I think there was this idea of, oh, I can just now go and start selling. And so as soon as you turn your art into a product, it's a different world.
Yeah.
It's a really different world. And so I don't know if they have that connection that you're talking about and those influences.
That's something to consider.
Yeah.
They've sort of lost some of the thought behind what goes into that. It's more focusing on what's going to sell, not why are they making
the meaning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
For
exactly.
themselves.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So when I started out as a writer, I didn't have any fantasy that I was going to become Hemingway or, something like that. I knew it was in the marketplace and it was a job.
Right.
And I don't know how I knew that. It might have been just interning at ad agencies and being in a meeting where I saw some pretty crazy behavior between clients and executives and thought, this isn't fun. Why are they doing this? And the key thing I realized was don't become too attached to your writing. Don't become too sensitive because you want to keep doing this for a living. Don't let it hurt your feelings.
Right.
So I had to separate the work I did that mattered versus what I was putting out there. Even though I cared about, obviously, my interviews, I wasn't emotionally attached personally, which I think helped me have the goal of making the interview and the story be more transformational for the artist because it wasn't about me. It was always about them.
And their story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So it was good.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's why the books helped because then I had lots of pages. I didn't have to just have 250 words or 1,500 words and wrap it up.
Right.
I could really get into it.
Go to your source.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yep.
So having so many achievements, so many things you've done.
Okay.
The accolades.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
You've had such a large impact on those that you've written about, those that have read your writings, and your other artistic work you've done as well, myself included. How has that sort of impacted how you proceed going forwards? How is one project to the next? What are some of those key things that a transformation you've seen occur that you've then sort of taken and internalized and been able to say, oh, wow, and take that to that next step and continue to create work that's been inspiring? What is sort of some key moments that you can think of where you've really had sort of that moment yourself?
That's a great question. And believe me, I do not feel the first part of what you said.
No.
So I've never felt I have an impact or anything. And someone once said, you're only as good as your last story. And that's usually how I wake up. So I wake up like I've done nothing. And there would be days where I'd force myself, go back and look at that index list, look at that portfolio. Oh yeah, I did do something last week. I am never sitting there feeling like I've done something big or whatever. But I think that the artists I interviewed, they also inspired me and they fed me because they had the courage to do what they were doing. And in a way, I didn't, because I realized that all of the things I wanted to write and I had put my fiber art aside, all of these things I wasn't living a balanced life. I was supporting them living a balanced life. So after a period of time, I realized I'm not going to feel like a whole person until I make this a whole picture. So I started two things. One, by the time you got older, so as I was a single mom from like day one, by the time you got older, I was freer to do things like take a course at Penland and really explore my own craft. And also I made a pact with whoever is out there, the universe, God, whatever, saying, okay, man, this has to start meaning more.
Yeah.
And just say, I'll keep doing it, but it needs to start meaning more. Because, I would be places, I'd go to a writing group and people would be talking about how to get published. And that was never a problem for me, which was weird. So I thought, okay, this is somehow in my destiny. I'm going to keep doing it, but man, I got to like it too. So that's where the books helped. So I got to be able to explore something deeper. And I think also bringing my own work into it helped.
And growing up, seeing you doing a lot of this work, it's always been such a visual example to live up to.
Oh.
You have a way of going about projects that sort of similar to jewelry and similar to writing. When you see the finished product, you don't see the process of how it's formed. And you have always had this elegant way of creating a visual throughout the process about the planning, the structure, how things sort of go from one step to the next, and it builds upon itself. It's very understated how much of that really goes into everything that you've done.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. So I love producing things. It doesn't even matter what it is. I love producing things. And I think my superpower is looking ahead.
Yeah, I seen the finished.
I'm very visual, but I see every step. I see the checklist. I'm constantly revamping the checklist. I'm seeing all the parts moving. I'm able to hold that all at the same time and even manage other people. Like on a book project, there might be 5 to 10 people or a printer in another country. There's something about that rhythm that feels really comfortable to me, although it's super stressful sometimes, but I see it. So I think when I was younger, when I was like 6 or 7, I wanted to make books. I didn't just want to write books. I wanted to make them. And I had this little printing press in my closet. And then when I was about 12, I think I would ride my bike after school sometimes, this little bookshop near where I lived. And I saw this perfect book one day. And it was a Zen meditation book. And I think I bought it less for the subject matter and more for the book itself. The covers were made out of balsa wood.
Ooh.
And it had calligraphy on it with this red silk binding. And I just said, no, that's a beautiful book.
Yeah.
I want to make that. So ironically, the first artist I wrote about, she entertained the idea of me making balsa wood covers when I told her this, which would have fit perfectly with being a woodblock artist, but obviously not affordable. But I think there was this concept of making the whole package. Mm-hmm. And that book set that spark for me. So whether it's a story or a book or a weaving, I'm a weaver, I'm able to sort of see the process of it. And I really love that.
And it very much comes through in the finished product.
Thank you.
Seeing you make the most beautiful coffee table books. I'm sure, Mark, I'm pretty sure I've shown you a couple.
Thank you.
There's this elegance and thought that goes into it.
Thank you.
That displays who the book is about, but also it has its own presence. It is art in itself to display an artist. And
that's so beautiful.
You
It is
really
a living
get to
thing.
that.
It's definitely embodied. But see, artwork is that way too.
Mhm.
And we've seen some paintings that feel kind of dead. And we've seen some
Yeah.
sculptures where why is that there on the side of the road? And there's jewelry that you just can't get enough of.
Mhm.
And it evolves and grows as you wear it. And it's just this living thing.
Yeah.
It's undeniable, right?
Yep.
So I think I want that in what I create. And early on, when I first became a freelancer, I got an assignment, and that's how I had to do this kind of dual thing and have a pseudonym and all of this because it was a conflict of interest. But I remember thinking, I totally see this. Awesome, I can do this. And then I got another assignment and I struggled and I said, I can't see it finished.
Yeah.
And I said, I can't do it. I couldn't
Yeah.
see it. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I get halfway through a project, I'm and it's gone.
Right.
And it sits on my bench, and then I'm maybe one day I'll get back to it and it'll become something else.
Or something else.
But once you lose that spark, once you lose that vision, it's dead.
Yeah, it's dead.
And I tell my students, I'm you got to go for it, man. You
Right.
can't stop, you know,
Right.
because if you take too long, it's going to die on you. So,
Yeah, that's true.
Or
And
if
you
you're-
can't overdo it. Then you
No.
kill
No.
it.
Exactly.
yeah.
Or if it's going in the wrong direction. I've had many times where I've been working on a project and just keep going and keep going to
Right.
the point of almost insanity.
Right.
And you'll say, no, that's
Yeah.
not it yet.
Right.
And that's when I was able to get there and get to the piece that it needed to be.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you're just going in the wrong direction
Yeah.
and you don't realize it.
Or you've forgotten something we talked about. There was, I guess he was a sculptor, but he also made jewelry pendants out of his sculpture. Bill Worrell, he has a gallery, or did at one point, in Santa Fe. And I was doing a story about him. I think it was for Southwest Art Magazine, and he lived in Texas, and he was going to be in Santa Fe. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to take this guy somewhere. How can I make this interesting? So a lot of his pieces were these warriors, like from petroglyphs that he found in caves. And I thought, well, this is when we could do this. I'm going to drive him down to those dinosaur rocks in Galisteo, and I'm going to climb him up there and show him petroglyphs. We could actually do that at one point. Now it's fenced off. But took him up there, and he was so like excited to see all these pieces. And he would always do these pieces with holding a full moon. And I said, have you ever done one with the new moon?
Yeah.
And he just looked at me sort of dumbfounded. And I said, women and cycles and tribes, this goes back through history. He was so excited. He went right back and did one with the new moon. And I thought, that's so cool. So, and then he sold it as a pendant because he really wanted to get that out there. So it was something that he just hadn't quite seen, but he was already doing it.
Right.
Yeah.
Just a different version.
Yeah. Different perspective that you can bring to it. So, yeah. And I think, Mark, you said something before we started, an article that I did about found objects and recycled work. And this just is, one comment that, I'm thinking about. Obviously we're at Rio. I call it Rio. But you have some of the world's best tools here, and some things that some artists couldn't afford, and some that are extremely accessible. Jewelry making is so accessible.
Oh, yeah.
And you can make it from
Anything. Macaroni.
Anything. In fact, you did when you were little. Macaroni, wire, found objects, trash, anything. And so that is also inspirational when you see people take something and make something beautiful, and it wasn't, precious metals or...
But now it is.
Yeah, now it is once
Now it
they've
is.
done it. Absolutely.
So on that note, what's something that, if you were speaking to someone getting into this, a newer generation, the new sort of someone approaching how to do this, what's something that you would say to inspire them, something that you would say is your biggest inspiration about it?
One thing I would say is, if you can, find an archive of some Lapidary Journal magazines.
They're out there.
Yeah, they're totally out there, and dive into it. Look at who these greats were and big names and people who are up and coming. Look at those ads with the tools. Look at what was being sold then and what people were working with. It's kind of like old skis, I guess, if you're a skier. But, really go back to what was before you, because, artists have done that for years, apprentice with masters and followed that lead. I would say really do that. Always listen to that voice inside. And if there's a time to turn off the social media and the phone, do that, and use some other way that you usually create. Like if you're someone who sits down at the bench and just starts hammering, take a sketchbook and go on a walk and sit down and draw a piece of jewelry. Do something different than the way you usually do it.
Yeah.
And some spark might happen. I mean, in the old days when things weren't as fast, I would always handwrite the first page or two of a story, because something happened so much differently than when it was coming from my hand than when I was sitting at a keyboard. So, yeah, I would say maybe do that.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And one last question for you. We've talked a lot about work you've done in the past, people you've talked with in the past, and looking forwards, what are some projects that you might be working on right now?
In terms of jewelry?
In terms of your own work?
Are you hinting at you want me to write my own book? Yes, that. I am going to do that. Good. I am working on that. Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah, probably that. Something collaborative. I do workshops sometimes based on intuitive creativity. And so it's really great to work with people with modalities they're not used to. So tapestry weaving, journaling for people who don't like to write, or they say they're afraid, things like that. So probably a little more of that just to get the juices going with other people.
Thank you, Annie, for joining us here today. It was wonderful to have you. Tell the audience a little bit about how they can find you.
Okay. Well, I have a website, weavingandforging.com. It's also my handle on Instagram. And I just want to thank you for inviting me here because I had you on my podcast when you were very young as a burgeoning jewelry designer. And I think I really made you freeze. So this has been so delightful to be invited to your podcast.
This is awesome.
I've just loved that.
Oh, it was so wonderful having you here today.
Really, really, really loved it. You're just the bomb. So thank you.
Thank you for joining
and Mark,
us.
thank you too. I'm so glad
It's
to
good to
have
be
you
here.
here too.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for today's episode. A huge thank you to our guest, Annie Osburn, for sharing her insights. To learn more about Annie and her work, visit weavingandforging.com and Instagram at weavingandforging. Big thanks to our sponsor, GRS. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a 5-star review. It helps us grow and bring you more amazing content. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.